There's been a tremendous amount of growth in the amount and range of information available on the internet. Users' requests for online information can be captured by the long tail model. I'd like to introduce Dr. Chetan Kumar and Dr. John Norris, who are going to present some of their research that investigate causes for the long tail. Some of the results can be used to design better online ad placing strategies, affiliate advertising models, and better internet caching algorithms. Dr. Chetan Kumar is an associate professor of information systems and operation management at California State University, San Marcos. And before this, he received his PhD from Purdue University. So with that, it's my pleasure to present Dr. Chetan Kumar.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to Nikhil and Noman for organizing this tech talk. My co-author, John Norris, is in the audience. So if you have any really difficult questions, please feel free to direct it to him. Well, actually, I'm kidding. I'll be happy to answer all questions and he can join us. The deal was that he comes along for this trip and I do the talking. So, all right. So, the topic of our presentation is what does the long tail mean for online services providers, and what are some of the factors that may affect the way in which we can design online ad pricing mechanisms, affiliate marketing programs, online marketing strategies, and also separately internet caching. This is the agenda for our talk today. Now, in order to make this less of an academic discussion, we're not going to spend time separately talking about the related literature. We'll try to weave that into our discussion as we go forward. Now, we are reasonably confident of the model and data analysis of our study. What I think would be interesting for this audience would be the application of this model to different settings. So therefore, we will try and do that in our setting. Now, perhaps as secluded academics, we may be completely barking up the wrong application tree, right? So it'll be wonderful to get your feedback. As far as the talk is concerned, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end. If you have any clarification questions as we go forward during the talk, please feel free to ask me. Else, please reserve all the discussion questions to the end, and I'll be happy to go back to relevant sections as well for any questions that you may have. Okay, so let's start by first having a brief introduction of the long tail model. Now, given this audience at Google, I'm sure many of you are already aware of that, so I'll keep this reasonably short. The long tail captures behavior online in certain situations where the long tail characterizes the behavior that there are a few very frequently requested objects, which is shown by the steep end of the long tail, and a large number of infrequently requested objects that is shown by the tapering long tail. Now, what is interesting is that often 50% or more of the total requests may actually be taken up by these infrequently requested objects, and that forms the long tail. So a practical example of that would be Amazon versus Blockbuster physical stores, or Netflix versus Blockbuster stores, or Amazon versus Barnes & Noble physical stores. Amazon and Netflix can operate on the long tail because they can have a large number of infrequently requested objects, but the Blockbuster and Barnes & Nobles cannot in their physical store environment. And as you may have noticed, recently, both Blockbuster as well as Barnes & Nobles are either filing for bankruptcy or are in the process of getting close to that. So that to us tells us a little bit about the power of the long tail. Now, the concept of long tail was popularized by Chris Anderson, who built upon an earlier study by Brynjolfsson. And the past studies have demonstrated long tail behavior for online product sales, such as books, CDs, movies being sold at Amazon or Netflix for movie viewing. For our study, we wanted to step back at a higher level of abstraction and demonstrate if this long tail behavior exists for online objects requested, basically websites requested. So that was the first aspect. Beyond that, going beyond earlier studies, we were interested to observe if different factors such as the user's geographical location or the time of access affects the shape of the long tail in terms of the degree of steepness that that particular long tail has. Besides that, for me personally, what is also interesting is whether this long tail model may be used in order to predict the expected number of requests online at a very granular level. So can it be some kind of a predictive model? Now, if all these things are true, then the effect of this kind of long tail behavior will have implications for online ad pricing, affiliate marketing models, online marketing strategies, and perhaps even internet caching, as we'll see as we go forward. All right, so like I said, instead of discussing about 120 years of research and hammering that at you at one setting, we'll try to weave that through the presentation as we go forward. So let's start with discussing some of the motivation of our studies. Now, the two factors that we were interested in terms of long tail behavior were, one, user location. So the question we had was that for users located at different time zones in the US, let's say in the 4 different time zones, are there any differences in browsing behavior which affect the long tail? That's the first factor. The second factor is time of access. Does the user's browsing behavior differ depending on different times at which they may access information online? For example, weekdays versus weekends. So these were the two factors. And of course, whenever you're doing a study, you guys should probably always ask that, so what? What do you care? Now, if these two factors indeed affect long tail behavior, then if you consider different online ad pricing mechanisms, affiliate marketing programs, other online marketing strategies, it doesn't matter which is the company that's providing that. If we can improve the way in which these models perform based on sensitivities to user location and time of access differences, that would be of interest to online services providers. So that is one set of areas that we're interested at. The other area where these results may also be applicable would be internet caching, which some of you may be aware is essentially ways in which to speed up the internet by reducing user delays. Once again, implications for differences that may be leveraged based on user location and time of access may also be considered for that. Now, given today's topic, we won't probably have time to talk about the internet caching aspect. We will focus our attention on the online ad pricing and affiliate marketing applications. All right, so with that, we are ready to discuss our model. Now, essentially, for our model, what we are positing is that the frequency of requests for different objects online may be inversely proportional to the rank of that particular object that is shown by the equation as R, and a characterizing exponent S, which determines the shape of the tail, while sigma is a normalizing constant. Now, an initial version of this was developed a long time back by a philologist or a language researcher called George Ziff, who first identified what eventually came to be known as the Ziff distribution, where for the corpus of English language, he identified that the frequency of requests of words was inversely related to the rank of that word for, let's say, the 1,000 most frequently requested words. So this was a while back. So would anyone like to guess, based on the Ziff distribution, what is the most requested word in English? Any other guesses? actually, that was a trick question. That is correct, absolutely the correct answer. So the is the most requested object in the English language, and it is about 7% of the time. Second most requested English word, anyone? Not and. There. No, not there. Good try. Okay, of is the second most requested word. So that is about 3.5% of the time. All right. Now, if you were to map out the ZIF distribution with f of r on the y-axis and the rank of different objects on the x-axis, you see that the shape of the curve is determined by the characterizing exponent s. And essentially, as the value of s increases, you see the steepness of the curve increases, which means that the requests for objects are more homogeneous. That means the most requested objects take up a greater proportion of the total requests, while as s decreases, the curve becomes less steep or flatter, which means that there is an increasing long tail. That is, the infrequently requested objects have a greater proportion of the total requests. So with that, we are ready to launch into our model. Now, when we are looking at past studies, there were a number of past studies that talk about the ZIF distribution. Some past studies talk about the long tail. It took us a while to get to see the connection between the two of them. So personally, in a rare aha moment for me, which for me is very far and few and far in between, I figured out that if you take a log transformation of the ZIF distribution and you get the expression on top, that maps directly onto a log linear regression of f of r versus rank r, as you can see. And as a matter of fact, the characterizing exponent s directly maps to the absolute value beta 1 of the log linear regression. So when I figured this out, I was pretty happy about it for about a week or so and said, all right, it's not a bad contribution. But on further analysis and further related literature discussion, review, we figured out that these log linear regressions were actually used by economists to study income and wealth distribution. Oh, well, I would say Pareto used it for the first time in 1896, right? So essentially, we were scooped by Pareto by about 100 or 120 years, but what's a century between friends? So the point here is that if we take the connection between ZIF and log linear regressions can be shown by these log transformation, and recently these log linear regressions were also used by Brynjolfsson to show the distribution of online product sales, and also which is what Chris Anderson built upon to come up with the term and popularize the long tail expression. All right, so for our data analysis, we procured data from the IR Cache network, which has a collection of 10 proxy servers in 9 different US locations. And for focusing in on the location differences, we focused on servers in 4 US time zones, which include the Silicon Valley, which is right here in your backyard, the Boulder, which is in Colorado, Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, and New York in New York. So servers in 4 different time zones. And as a matter of fact, for website requests for the Silicon Valley server, chances are that we may have some of the website requests that some of you in the audience may have had in the past that we may use for our data analysis. But don't panic, it's completely anonymous. So we have no idea what you search for, but we may have your data. And so in order to see location differences, we focused on these 4 locations. And for the second factor, for time of access differences, we took the data in each of those 4 server locations and partitioned it between weekday and weekend. And that helped set up our model as we go forward. So with that, we are ready to launch into our regressions. So we ran regressions for frequency of website requests onto the rank of sites at both the aggregate level, that is the pool data from all the servers, which we call all servers, surprise, surprise. And we also we broke it down to 4 individual server locations at those 4 locations that I mentioned. And once we ran the regression, we observed that we see a very high R-squared value for both the all servers pool data as well as for each of those 4 individual locations. So this shows that there's a good linear fit between frequency of requests and rank of site for both aggregate as well as those 4 individual locations. So if you were to map this onto a curve where you plot hits per site on the y-axis and rank of sites on the x-axis, we get a good linear fit, as you see by the straight line sloping to the left, and which again shows that there is indeed a good fit between hits per site and rank of site. Now, to you guys, this might just look like, just another graph, but to me, this is a very beautiful object, because once we got this, that basically told us that the 2 years that we had spent working on the study was not really wasted. So if I remember right, John Norris was in Chicago at that time, and he used to keep emailing us these charts, and those were wonderful gifts that you had for us, John. Thank you. All right. So with that, sorry? Well, so SAS, I believe, has natural log as the base. Right. Different applications use different bases, but correct. So I believe it's natural log for SAS, right? But the results are the same irrespective of to the base 10. Sure. Right. All right. So essentially, once we see this confirms to us that there's indeed a good linear fit between hits per site and rank of site, which leads us to confirm our first hypothesis that there exists a long tail of a large number of infrequently requested websites in addition to a few very popular ones. So note that going back to our earlier discussion about how this maps to the ZIF distribution, we also can confirm from this result that the frequency of requests, the expected number of requests, is indeed inversely proportional to the rank of that particular object for different online settings. So that was our first result. Now we are ready to observe if there are any differences in the long tail behavior, which is essentially the steepness of the curve at those 4 locations. For that, we need to observe if there is a significant difference between the beta 1 coefficients, which, if you remember, is the steepness of the curve at those 4 locations. In order to do that, we actually employed a little trick, because if you notice, we have 4 locations, which means that there are 4 C2 possible combinations of locations, that is 6 possible location pairs. So what we did is that we calculated the difference in beta 1 coefficients for each of those 6 pairs. And going back to our earlier discussion, remember that the absolute value of beta is nothing but the characterizing exponent S of the ZIF distribution, which of course shows you the steepness of the curve. We employed a paired sample t-test statistic and confirmed that the difference in coefficient is indeed significant for each of the 6 pairs of location. So that shows that the steepness of the curve at each of those 6 location pairs is indeed different, which leads us to confirm our second hypothesis, that is, that the user's geographical location indeed has an effect on the diversity of website requests at each of those 4 locations, and therefore tells us that the long tail behavior is indeed different in terms of steepness. Now, on getting this result, 2 questions come to mind, at least to us. One is that why does this happen? And 2 is that can we figure out some subtle differences between these 4 locations in terms of diversity of website requests in order to group or characterize these locations based on that kind of subtle measure? Now, for the first one, to answer the first question, what we did is we pulled out demographic data for those 4 locations from census.gov website, which, by the way, I would highly recommend if anytime you're looking for demographic data. And we focused on the counties in which each of those 4 servers are located. So, for example, the 4 counties would be Santa Clara, Boulder, Champaign, and New York. And one demographic factor that we considered was the percentage of immigrants at each of those 4 counties. So if you look at that, Silicon Valley has 34% foreign-born persons. New York has almost 30%, which is significantly different from that of Boulder, which is about slightly less than 10%, and Urbana-Champaign, which is 8%. Correspondingly, the language spoke other than English that is spoken at home, that is foreign languages at home, for those 4 locations are correspondingly, of course, higher. For Silicon Valley, it's 45%. For New York, it is almost 42%, while Boulder and Urbana-Champaign are lesser at almost 14% and 12% respectively. So that was one factor that we identified. Beyond that, we were thinking, okay, what could be some of the other factors? So for that, we pulled out the per capita income at those 4 locations. Now again, you see some differences. For example, Silicon Valley is 33,000 almost. New York is almost 43,000. Boulder and Urbana-Champaign are lesser at almost 29,000 and about 20,000 for Urbana-Champaign. However, the differences here are not that significant. So, we didn't want to push our luck and say that this might also be causing it. However, the point that we took away from this is because of differences in demographic profiles, such as the percentage of immigrants, that in turn affects the diversity of website requests at these 4 locations, which in turn affects the shape of the long tail. So that is one factor. And then to answer our second question that we had asked, that is, can we think of some more subtle differences between these locations, between just saying that, okay, they're different? In order to do that, we mapped the beta 1 coefficients, which once again shows us the shape of the long tail, and we observe that for the New York and Silicon Valley beta 1 coefficients, if you map that, you see that they are much closer in terms of diversity of requests compared to Boulder and Urbana-Champaign, which are on the left-hand side are closer together to one another, which indeed tells us that perhaps there is indeed some type of differences between the coastal locations in the US, that is New York and Silicon Valley, which are closer together in terms of diversity of requests, and the inland locations, which are closer together in terms of diversity of requests. Now, we would hasten to add that this is just a graphical measure of this, all right? We do not know of any subtle statistical measure to give you this kind of grouping. As a matter of fact, I personally think that there isn't no real room for subtlety in statistics, right? It's either accept or reject, black or white. So that would be something to look for in the future, that is to come up with some kind of measure to group these differences in location, and that is something that we'll mention at our limitations at the end. So with that, we are now ready to consider the other factor that we looked at for our study, and that is, are there any time of access differences? For that, question? Correct, for the population demographics. Correct. We pulled out population demographic data for each of those 4 counties and just tried to identify interesting differences. Size, we did not see. Actually, we didn't focus on that. We just looked at differences in demographic factors, which actually would be an interesting thing to look at. Sure. We just looked at diversity of the population. That's it. You're right. We didn't consider sizes. So as a matter of fact, at the end, when we talk about some of the future research areas, we do say that there could be other demographic factors to consider. Could be size, income, could be the educational profile of those 4 areas. Different kind of people work at different places. Sure, that could be. You could have a larger set of immigrants coming into an area that has more diverse. I think that's a pretty good point, and that could be something to look for in the future. We'll talk about that in the limitations. All right. So for our second factor, that is the time of access differences, what we did is that for each of those 4 locations, we partitioned the data between weekdays and weekends. And once again, we ran the log linear regressions between frequency of requests onto the rank of the site. And when we do that, we again see that there's a very high R-squared value for each location between weekday and weekend, which confirms to us that there's indeed a long tail behavior even at the difference of weekday and weekend at each location. So that was one result. Beyond that, in order to see the differences between weekday and weekend, we once again used our earlier method of the paired sample test statistic to see the difference in beta 1 coefficients. And when we do that, you'll notice that, for example, for all those 4 locations, the absolute value of the beta 1 coefficients is indeed lower than that for weekend compared to that of weekday, which tells us that the shape of the long tail is indeed less steep in the weekends, which means that the weekend has more diverse requests at each of those 4 locations compared to weekdays. And of course, correspondingly, once again, when we calculate the difference in beta 1 coefficients and using the statistic, we confirm that these differences are indeed significant at each of those 4 locations between weekday and weekend. As a matter of fact, once again, if you were to plot the beta 1 coefficients for weekday and weekend for each of those 4 locations, you again see the difference visually that we had seen in the previous case for location differences. And this confirms to us our third hypothesis that the time of access of the user indeed has an effect on the diversity of website requests at every location between weekday and weekend. Now, why does this happen? We believe, because users have more free time in the weekend that gives them more time to access more diverse sources of information online, which helps in making the steepness of the curve less steep in the weekends, and therefore there are more diversified website requests than it were in the weekday, where you have less free time. So those were the results of our study. We are now ready to discuss some of the applications, and we'll be happy to get your feedback. Now, the first area that we considered are how can we affect the online ad pricing mechanisms that we have right now if the platform provider, in this case Google, let's take, for example, if you have prior information as to the expected number of requests for that particular object online at very granular levels in terms of differences in location and time of access, can we enhance the online ad pricing mechanism? In order to do that, we consider the case where consider 2 markets. The one on the left is the less diversified one, right, which is shown by the more steep long tail. And the one on the right is a more diversified market, which shows a more tapering long tail. Let us take the case of 2 objects, M1 and M2, where M1 is the more popular object and M2 is the less popular object. Now consider 2 cases. The first case is the price that you set for the online ad pricing that you set for M1 in the less diversified on the left market on the left. The difference between P1, the corresponding prices, and P2 in the less diversified market, that is in the more steep long tail behavior, should be greater than the corresponding prices that you see in the more diversified market, that is P1 dash and P2 dash, right? So in effect, P1 minus P2 should be greater than P1 dash minus P2 dash. That's the first case. The second case is for the same object that is being advertised in these two different markets. For the more demanded object M1, the price that you see for that in the less diversified market should be P1. The corresponding price that you'll see for that in the more diversified market should be P1 dashed. And it is no surprise that P1 is greater than P1 dashed, because obviously you tend to have more requests for P1 in the less diversified market or the more concentrated market. But interestingly, the corresponding price that you expect to see for the less demanded object M2 should be P2 in the first case, but the corresponding price in the more diversified market should be P2 dashed, because it is a higher proportion of the total number of requests in the more diversified market. That means that P1 should be greater than P1 dash, and P2 should be less than P2 dash. So what we are saying is that if you take into account the diversity of the market, you will appropriately price the online ads that will take this into account. Now, we do know that the current online ad pricing mechanism is, of course, a bidding process, right? So the prices that you see right now depend on the competition for a particular keyword or search term or whatever. And of course, you also have a quality score index based on the reputation of the advertiser, the quality of the landing page, and the click-through rate. You appropriately change that. Now, that is good. That is a good model. What we're saying is that if the platform provider has prior information about the expected number of requests for that particular object, depending on the diversity of the market, you can perhaps enhance the current online ad pricing mechanisms by setting appropriate reserve prices based on your knowledge of the expected number of requests. So that is the first application. So essentially what we are trying to do is that we are trying to create an omniscient AdWords oracle, right? And of course you can substitute AdWords with AdSense or Facebook ads or whatever. It really doesn't matter. Now, I don't know if you guys like anagrams, where you rearrange the words to come up with something really smart and funny, right? So I tried to do that for this mouthful omniscient AdWords oracle. I completely failed at it, right? Couldn't think of anything funny. So I basically called it HALI, right? Now, for those of you who have some kind of science fiction leaning, you'll probably recognize HAL from 2001, A Space Odyssey. I just thought HALI sounded prettier. So HALI essentially knows exactly what is the demand for this object at this location at this time, and therefore can price the cost per click for that accordingly. In effect, I presume this would be analogous to the goal of search as said by Larry Page, right? So you guys are the experts on that. So does anyone remember the statement that you have for the goal of search by Larry Page? It's there on your website. I looked it up. I even have it written down on a sticky in case I get it wrong, if I want to quote that. Anyone? Okay. So the perfect search engine would understand exactly what you mean and give back exactly what you want, right? Your famous tagline. So good luck with that one. Okay. So in a sense, this is analogous to that. So our goal is to be able to get this at very granular levels. So for example, HALI would know the demand for surfboards in, let's say, Amphitheater Parkway in July weekends. Okay, for the term surfboard, keyword, key search term, or any kind of ad based on that. Now, that is the goal. If we cannot get to that goal, we keep stepping back at higher level of abstractions till we have more certainty about the expected number of requests. So if we cannot figure out the requests for surfboards in Amphitheater Parkway, perhaps we can consider Mountain View. If not Mountain View, we step higher. Perhaps you can consider Santa Clara. If not Santa Clara, perhaps California. Again, in terms of the time, If the goal is July weekends and we can't get there, perhaps we consider weekdays. If not weekdays, we step higher to months. If not the month, then perhaps the summer season. If not the season, perhaps the year. So depending on the accuracy of our result, we either go as granular as we can, or we keep stepping back to higher levels of abstraction. Did you have a question? Sorry. All right. So essentially what we are saying is that if you, instead of considering an aggregate demand curve, which you see here with the black line, what we'd like to do is break it down to greater levels of granularity in terms of, let's say, either location or time of access or both. It doesn't matter. We break it down in terms of the diversity of requests at granular levels. For example, that aggregate curve may be broken down to the red line, which shows a more steeper long tail at some location, and a blue line, which is a less steep long tail at another location. Now, note that this model would be robust to account for differences in ranking that that object may have, at the aggregate level, if the rank was R0 and the corresponding price was P0. Instead, at the granular level, you may have different rankings, R1, which corresponds to P1, and R2, which corresponds to P2, and therefore we set online prices at these granular levels. Now, it'll be interesting when for our data set, we are talking about in the order of millions for the data that we analyzed. I guess a question that one may ask at the Google scale is that, will this be at all possible at the Google scale of perhaps in the order of billions? Now, I feel that once the initial set of rankings are done for those objects in terms of popularity, perhaps by considering some kind of sorting and merging algorithms to determine the rank of a new object should possibly be, once we've done that, to rearrange the ranks should possibly be able to be done using some kind of a sorting algorithm in order of n log n operations. And to insert the new object would be possibly in the order of n operations, which therefore shows that you should be able to deal with this in polynomial time in terms of complexity. So essentially what we are trying to say is that what is the benefit of this to vendors and advertisers? So this is some of the preview of our models that we're considering for our next study, where what we wanted to ask ourselves was that what is the utility of the vendor? In this case, it would be the platform provider such as Google, in considering this kind of a granular pricing mechanism. And similarly, what is the utility of the advertiser? Now, for the vendor's utility, we wanted to keep the objective function simple, and we said, let it be revenue maximization. So if the platform provider wants to maximize revenue, if looking at the expression on top, if the total revenues that they were getting before they go at granular pricing levels was the expression on the right-hand side, and the new revenues that they get once they break it down in terms of granular pricing due to location and time of access differences, let that be the one on the left-hand side for the top expression. As long as this utility is positive, the platform provider is better off on considering these kind of granular differences. Similarly, from the advertiser's perspective, we said that let the objective function be total ads maximization. So all the advertiser wants is greater click-through, greater ad views for the ad. So once looking at the expression on the bottom, if the total ads that the advertiser saw before considering granular pricing was the expression on the right-hand side, as long and the new set of ad views that you see is the expression on the left for the bottom equation, as long as this utility function is positive, the advertiser is better off in considering these kind of granular pricing differences based on location and time of access. Now, when we're considering this, one obvious player to consider beyond this would be the utility of the consumer. Now, that, in my opinion, becomes a little bit of a psychological question, which actually I'm not very good at identifying. That is, on the one perspective, someone may say that the utility of the consumer may be better off or may be better if they get more targeted advertising based on location or time of access differences. That's one perspective. But the other perspective could be perhaps the consumer is worse off because now they have even more intrusive ads compared to before, right? So I don't know which way that would go, but that would also be an interesting question to consider if one wanted to look at the utility of the consumer. Now, since we couldn't get to that answer, one easy way to avoid hard questions is to not consider them at all. So we kind of skip that for our future study, but that would also be an interesting thing to look at. So essentially, what we're saying is that the price for any object should be proportional to the expected number of requests, which is shown by the expression on top. And if we were to substitute back for that expression into the earlier expressions for utility of the vendor and utility of the advertiser, and consider the case at which objects are, in this particular example, being sold at two different locations in terms of granular pricing, and substituting back for that expression and jumping through a bunch of mathematical hoops, eventually we come down to the simplified expression as this is the utility of the vendor and this is the utility of the advertiser for these two particular functions. Now, if you'll notice that while we are estimating this, for the utility of the advertiser, the click-through rate, which is C, we've assumed that the click-through rate would be constant. To go back up, before the granular pricing mechanism, which is on the right-hand side of the bottom equation, and it is constant after as well when you consider granular pricing mechanism. So C remains constant for our model. Now, one may argue that actually the click-through rate should probably increase when you have more targeted advertising in terms of location and time of access, right? So in a sense, we are underestimating the utility of the advertiser in our model, which actually is a strength of our model, which is saying that actually it should be even greater than what we see. So going back, we come to our final expressions for vendor and advertiser. And essentially using this, we should be able to identify the boundary conditions for what are the values of R and S, where the utility of the advertiser and the vendor are both positive for given targeting based on location and time of access differences. Now, once again, it'll be interesting for us. We should probably be able to drill down to this for our data set. It would probably, for us, it'll be very interesting to see how that would figure out in terms of Google scale when you're talking about a much larger set of objects. But I believe we should be able to identify these kind of boundary conditions for different platforms. All right, so in conclusion, in our study, we essentially were interested to observe if users, location, and time of access affects the long tail of website requests. We tested our model on real-world proxy server data, and we confirmed three hypotheses. The first hypothesis, that there is indeed a long tail behavior in terms of diversity of website requests. This is true at the aggregate level as well as for each of the individual 4 server locations that we considered. And therefore, that means that the expected number of requests may indeed be demonstrated by the rank of that particular object, which in my opinion shows that this is an elegant model, as from Ziff earlier, because all we need to know in order to determine the expected number of requests is the rank of that particular object and nothing else for a given distribution. Of course, the characterizing exponent S will change that, but in my opinion, that shows a powerful model. The second hypothesis we confirmed is that the user location indeed has an effect on the diversity of website requests, which shows that the shape of the long tail does change based on user location. This is true for all 4 locations that we considered. The third hypothesis we confirmed is that the time of access also affects the heterogeneity of website requests in terms of the shape of the long tail. Again, this is true between weekday and weekend for each of the 4 locations that we considered. And to our knowledge, ours is the first study to demonstrate these location and time of access differences for long tail behavior. And we believe that this has implications for online ad pricing, for affiliate marketing, for online marketing strategy, and also for internet caching as the 4 areas that we could identify. So I think that's that. Our limitations, which is essentially our future research areas that we are considering. One is that we used a paired sample t-test statistic. Of course, another way we could consider is an ANOVA for measuring these differences. However, with an ANOVA, one has to make an additional assumption about equality of variances across the samples. So that is a caveat. Second is for demographic factors, we considered the percentage of foreign immigrants. As you mentioned during our talk, there could be other demographic factors that one can consider. Perhaps it could be the population size. Perhaps it could be income levels beyond what we looked at. Perhaps it could be the education level. Perhaps it could be the distribution of jobs, which in turn affect diversity of requests. So that would be a future area to look at. Then, as we had mentioned, it may be interesting to develop a subtle measure to help in characterizing differences in location that helps us group them together. Similarly, it would be interesting to consider a measure for the extent of difference that there is between weekday and weekend, a measure for that rather than just saying, okay, weekday and weekend are different. So that could be interesting. And finally, it would be interesting, in my opinion, to also consider more focused geographical areas. So for example, right now we looked at the city level. Perhaps we could also look at differences in long tail behavior at the zip code level. Perhaps it could be the street level, and going down to further focused geographical areas. Beyond that, one can also consider smaller time intervals. We considered weekdays and weekends. Perhaps you can look at weekdays. Perhaps you can consider days, hours, minutes, and so forth. However, there is a caveat that when you're doing this kind of more granular analysis, one does have to consider the diminishing marginal returns that one may get at looking at more and more granular levels in terms of increasing variability. So by risk pooling, as some of you may know, one is more confident of predicting expected number of requests at the aggregate level rather than at the individual level. So that means, to use a basketball analogy, one would be more confident of saying that LA Lakers would beat LA Clippers in a 7-game series, but you'll be less confident of predicting the outcome of a single game. But that would be an interesting area to look at, and that is identify the fine line of where the golden mean, as it were, between increased granularity and increased variation with more focused observances in geographical areas and time intervals. All right, so I think with that we are done with our presentation. If you have any further questions, or if you can consider any interesting mutual areas of research that we can look at, that I'll be happy to take them now. We are out of time, but any questions? All right. I think that's that. Thank you, Nikhil.